ancient times, when the land grew barren, the Great Spirit sent forth a woman to save the people from starvation. She traveled the world, and where her right hand touched the soil, potatoes took root. Where her left hand touched the soil, corn sprang up. When the world was once again rich and fertile, she sat down to rest. And when she rose again, tobacco grew thereafter.
Native Americans used tobacco for thousands of years before Europeans arrived and turned it into a commercial crop. By 1620, the annual tobacco yield in the Chesapeake was up to 60,000 pounds. By 1640, over 1 million. And by the end of the century, 35 million pounds. It became, quite literally, a cash crop. Tobacco was used to help finance the Revolutionary War, serving as collateral for loans from France. After the Civil War, cigarettes became more prevalent, surpassing cigars and chewing tobacco during World War I. During World War II, American GIs received cigarettes with their daily food rations. But tobacco had its detractors even early on.
Smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black, stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible smoke of the pit that is bottomless.
In the second half of the 20th century, smoking came under attack. Tobacco was linked to cancer and other diseases, and lawsuits against the industry giants proliferated. But at the dawn of the 21st century, Marlboro still continues to compete for the spot as the best-selling brand name product in the world. As demand for Virginia tobacco increased, so did the need for labor. As early as 1619, the first Africans arriving on a Dutch slave ship were traded for provisions at Jamestown. The Africans, like many poor Englishmen who were then arriving in the colony, were sold into indentured servitude. Technically, these servants would serve a 5-year term and then be free to work to purchase their own land. But in reality, many indentured servants worked considerably longer.
At the time that these Africans arrived in Virginia, Virginia had not decided to establish a slave society. It was going to be an English society, and they preferred people from England even over other Europeans. But once Africans arrived, eventually they were viewed as a source of labor.
Among the first Africans brought to North America was a man whom his Portuguese captors called Antonio. When he arrived in Jamestown in 1621, slavery did not yet exist in the colony. Thus, he became an indentured servant and was given an English name, Anthony Johnson. In 1625, Johnson married the only African woman residing on the plantation where he worked. After 20 years of servitude, Anthony Johnson finally purchased his freedom. By sponsoring 5 indentured servants from England, he then acquired his own 250-acre tobacco farm. Anthony Johnson prospered as an independent tobacco farmer in Virginia, yet at the same time, attitudes toward Africans in the region were changing. Sensing trouble, Johnson began to sell off parcels of his land to various white settlers. In 1664, the Johnson family moved to Somerset, Maryland, where they rented land and continued to farm. Farming in Maryland was successful from the start. Farmers produced a surplus of grain their first year and sent it to markets in New England. They then quickly moved into tobacco production. Soon, life in Maryland revolved around tobacco, as it did in Virginia.
Everyone smokes while working or idling. Men, women, girls, and boys from the age of 7 years.
One settler described tobacco as
a meat, drink, clothing, and monies.
Tobacco brought quick profits, but it also quickly depleted the nutrients in the soil. Because land was abundant, wealthy farmers were able to expand their holdings, and the gap between rich and poor steadily increased.
Servants are becoming free, but they aren't able to obtain the land that they had hoped they would get, and so easily at least. And so what they're doing is moving out to the frontiers of settlement, and that is causing constant friction between the settlers and the Native Americans.
Frontier farmers moving out beyond the fall line felt their interests to be increasingly at odds with those of the old money planters who dominated the eastern seaboard. In 1676, this friction erupted into organized violence led by Nathaniel Bacon.
See what sponges have sucked up the public treasure, and whether it hath not been privately contrived away by unworthy favorites and juggling parasites, whose tottering fortunes have been repaired and supported at the public charge.
Bacon himself is a young whippersnapper who comes from England and wants to become one of the leaders of Virginia, and finds himself kind of shut out of power by these sort of old guard people who are running everything. He then becomes the leader of these frontier fighters against the Indians, and it turns into a conflict between him and the old leaders of the colony who are in the government. And one of the things that the old guard in Virginia feared most was that black people who had been both servants and black people who were slaves would join with white people who were servants and white people who had become free to try to make an attempt to displace the government or to overturn the society. That was a fear. And there were some blacks among Bacon's supporters.
After months of violence and the sudden death of Nathaniel Bacon from dysentery, the colonial government was finally able to quell the uprising.
Last group of rebels to surrender was a group of about 80 or so white indentured servants and about 20 blacks. The planter class recognized the threat that this class alliance across racial lines represented to the planter class, and they subsequently very consciously sought to divide them by giving extra advantages to poor white people and denying those advantages to poor black people.
The fate of the black tobacco farmer, Anthony Johnson, is indicative of this trend. At the time of his death, Johnson still owned 50 acres of land. He attempted to leave them to his son Richard, but a Virginia court thwarted Johnson's desire. A jury found that because Johnson was a Negro and by consequence an alien, those 50 acres would be awarded to a local white planter instead. In the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, the labor system in the Chesapeake region moved ever more steadily from one based primarily upon white indentured servitude toward one based upon the enforced labor of African slaves.